I am speaking to you from the lands of the people of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong and I'd like to pay my respects to elders and ancestors past and present, and also to acknowledge that sovereignty over the lands and waters on which I live was never ceded. And this is Aboriginal land. We're speaking today to Kathrin Böhm, who runs a project in London called Company Drinks and has a proliferation of other projects that are things like Centre for Plausible Economies and the rural economics and my villages, so many things that you've done. And so we wanted to speak to you today to talk about your project Company Drinks mostly, but I think all of the things that we're speaking about will also maybe hopefully touch on some of your other projects as well. Like, what is Company Drinks and how did it start and how does it work?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm sitting in East London, but not as far east as Company Drinks. Company Drinks is based in what's called Greater London, Zone 6, in Barking and Dagenham. And Company Drinks is a drinks company and many other things, purposely many other things. It started in 2014 through an arts commission. I'm an artist. I work in public space. My main interest is to see how we either support existing public spaces or create new ones. So Company Drinks is a public space foremost. And yeah, we had an arts commission award money to set up a 1-year-long project. And I think through all the works I've done previously, I quite explicitly wanted to set something up that could continue, that isn't a project, but becomes a kind of reproductive cycle of something. So Company Drinks is informed by a lot of other previous work where we look at like local resources, kind of localizing a kind of collective production around them, look at different systems of trade to play, but also to enact different economies. So for Company Drinks, a lot of those ideas from previous work came together with this relatively simple idea of creating a continuous circle of collective production that shapes a drinks company. The important bit, how it connects to East London, is that history or community heritage of East Enders going hop picking. So London is relatively closeness to the countryside, and it was an important starting point. The idea of going picking together. Everybody who comes from a working class background in East London would recognize that term, going picking, because it was this like annual harvest, like paid holidays, working labor, mainly women and children going from the East End of London to the Kent countryside. And it was vast amounts of people. It was like 100,000 women and children every year, over 100 years. So it's not just a few people did it once in a while. It's really part of the kind of memory of East London. And of course, a lot of things have changed. You know, there's no traditional East End, the geography has changed, the demographics have changed dramatically. So this invitation to going picking again was the first invitation of Company Drinks in this new geography with its very different population. And the simple invitation to go picking again is easily recognized because it's a very simple invitation. Let's go picking. And then what I often do, or what we often do, is then to like make this very tangible, the whole process of we're going picking, we're making the drinks together, we're trading the drinks together, we are reinvesting. So after the first year, it became clear that Company Drinks was going to be this continuous cycle of drinks production.
I just have a quick question just for clarity. Do you know what the history of that movement of people from East London did that start as a kind of result of the enclosures? Is there no, it's not that.
No, not a straightforward capitalist market logic.
Free labor, cheap labor.
cheap labor. It's nothing but cheap labor. Kent was the biggest top growing area. It isn't anymore. And before the harvest got mechanized, they just relied on vast numbers of cheap labor. And I think a lot of cities have this relationship. And suddenly you have a big population of women and children who don't have income elsewhere. So that becomes one of the possible only incomes, and do this kind of temporarily. It wasn't just East Enders. It was a third of the pickers were local, a third of the pickers were travelers, and a third of the pickers came from East London. But I think that's a very kind of common relationship between cities and their kind of agricultural surroundings. But what's interesting about so there's I think the fact that it was mainly women and children, it was this temporary women-led culture time, and there's a lot of really interesting oral history collected from the women. And when we started researching this, the reasons for going picking were many. So of course the main reason for many was a bit of financial independence and income. But the reasons were everything from going on a holiday, getting the kids out of London, having time with other women, having time to yourselves away from the kind of more patriarchal immediate household structures. So those oral records were very kind of important in terms of saying, okay, company drinks will also have this multitude of reasons why people can join. And it will have this like multitude of identities as well. It can be a company, it can be a community space, it can be a bar. So I think this multitude of reasons why women went picking has directly informed company drinks being this quite not so clear one thing. Sorry. But it's a universal history, it's like a history of like cheap labor within agricultural production.
I guess for me, I wonder if that connects to the history of the enclosures and the commons, and I think all of that is sort of written as the beginning of capitalism anyway. So people were forced out of, there was a kind of supernucleation towards cities, towards urbanization, that often meant that rural knowledges were moved into the cities through the Enclosures Acts. Which I
mean, it definitely is, but I think time-wise, that is too disconnected that probably the families of the 1870s would reconnect the enclosures and reconnect with the land. We mainly reconnected with this quite exceptional culture of the inner city community actually having a rural memory and a rural heritage, which is normally more part of the upper and middle classes, that you go to the countryside every summer. That's not a heritage accessible so easily if you don't have that mobility.
I saw these amazing pictures in the Isle of Dogs. I went to the Isle of Dogs kind of cultural trust. They had this archive room, and there were loads and loads of pictures. When I first moved to London, so in 2010, I just went there and had a look, and there was some amazing pictures of all the people going there. So when I found out about your project, I was really interested in it because I've seen those pictures.
The scale of it was quite amazing, because then of course you have a whole architecture around this. You have this temporary housing across Kent. You have train lines. There's a lot of temporary culture around it, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've been talking a lot. I mean, it's interesting to think about this sort of rural and urban, or the countryside and the city. And it's something that's, often come up with also some of the other projects that we've been speaking to. But there's always a different social or cultural or a political context, obviously, right? I mean, there's certain overlaps, and yet they're coming from really different knowledges, I guess, and histories. And I guess I is curious about these, like we've been talking about interdependence and autonomy quite a lot, and we were just curious about how you see those terms within the work that you're doing, and also, related to that, how does company drinks just as a community is something that you're creating now, which is referencing certain pasts and certain histories, how are you organizing now, and how is that sort of different, right? I mean, in a way, well, disorganizing, I guess, in the context of this particular project. But is there something you're taking from these histories, as you said, of women and the reasons they kind of did go out to pick, and so maybe just to reflect a little bit on how you are, thinking about organizing. What are the relationships that exist between you and others in the community you're building? And yeah, just
yeah. Well, I think this rural urban connection is a very strong one, which we don't stress too much, but that is something to recognize within a completely changed landscape of London, who has rural memories, who comes from a rural background, who is part of which histories. So this going picking is a kind of universal enough invitation. And we know it from whoever is coming to those trips that a lot of people can reconnect it with a memory from elsewhere. So of course, the East Enders will reconnect it with the hop picking. A lot of other families reconnected with picking mangoes somewhere or picking bluebells in Lithuania. So in that sense, this going picking is a very kind of basic human experience that allows to draw together a lot of geographies, and that seems to work. We of course, in the first few years, this kind of hopping heritage was very dominant, and this became an issue. This is this kind of like a white working class heritage, or how much do we want to open this up? So we are much more careful now with not saying this is a reenactment of a particular community's experience. This is really this universal activity of enjoying to pick someone and eat it and make food and maybe trade it. And maybe that's where the autonomy comes in. So of course, even though we completely think of everything we do as a kind of in interdependence, every single contribution underpins another contribution and makes the whole thing possible. With company drinks, and we're really tiny, but to have a little bit of autonomy within the organization where we can respond to a request or quickly do something, this little bit of independence as an organization is actually very valuable to us, where we can also maybe make irrational decisions, or we don't have a master plan and see through a kind of social enterprise plan for the next 5 years. So this little bit of autonomy in terms of an independent economy allows us to react very often the way we want to react. And I think that has changed the last few years. In the first years, this kind of drinks production has very much driven the narrative. With Corona, that of course has massively been disrupted, and now we are much more organizing around the groups and the regular users who actually want to use us, and activities are led by the groups rather than us continuing or overimposing the cycle too much. So there's a change happening at the moment.
So you were producing drinks, and now you're more of a community.
We still are.
Yeah.
But in the first years, it was also the drinks. I don't know if you've seen the photos, but sometimes you have like a family bottle. So we always called it like family portraits, and because all those it's always a family or the extended family goes picking. So I very much like those portraits to say, look, that's a kind of contemporary portrait of this neighborhood, because the bottles document who went picking, what we went, ideas for recipes and so on. So those photos were very, very important in order to talk about we are making something, we're doing this together, and it's quite tangible. You know, it's a drink at the end of the day. So they were very important in order to communicate the realness of the invitation. And I think last year, obviously, we had no drinks outlets because it's mainly bars. We had not many of those big trips, which are always quite spectacular, you know, like 80 people, that quite nice. And we have refurbished our building in Barking. So we've shifted a little bit the emphasis from going out and going picking to actually taking over the building more and settling more in with the different user groups who are part of company drinks. So we are making less drinks, but less of the resources go into producing the drinks at the moment. Most of the resources go into looking after groups, well-being, providing programs that are really needed.
We have been thinking a lot about, because the premise of the Disorganising work sort of program is around what are the narratives that can support radical shifts in the way that we share and produce resources. And I think you've spoken about going picking, and you've spoken about like kind of collective working a little bit. But I wonder about some of these. Is this practice of bringing people together also about sort of changing narratives about resources and how people have access to things? Or?
I think, like sometimes when I look at company drinks, we discuss it a lot, how much we keep this openness in the language. You know, we hardly ever specifically say this is about changing the economy, or this is about changing food systems, or this is about the commons. And many others around do it, and we reflect ourselves, you know, and they reflect on us. So, but it's a tone that we had from the beginning, I think, with the idea that many different interests can actually come into the company, and they can come for different durations. You know, some people come once, some people have been coming for 7 years. So to quite purposefully leave it ambiguous, which is sometimes a problem. But overall, we think to have many access points, so you can enter based on your own interest, has actually worked quite well so far. So it's not very prescriptive in terms of we make drinks and you have to make drinks. Mm-hmm. It's more around, I think, a cycle of we are growing, we are tending, you know, to our own well-being and to what we grow, and we make drinks and we socialize, but we also trade together. That narrative works better for us. In terms of just allowing a much broader community to actually make use of company drinks. It is very, very mixed in terms of who is coming and what reasons people are coming for. And I think that's kind of the interest in like a public space. You know, how can you actually create quite an open but complex public space where interests can meet, and they meet quite directly. You know, they meet when we do something together. So in that sense, it's a little bit more abstract, and the language around it is not so politicized. But I think the way who we work with, what other movements we connect with, make it clear that ultimately this is about, of course, changing food systems and changing society. But that wouldn't be the best message to walk into all the time.
No, and I like the fact that they're all verbs, this sort of doing things together and lots of people that we've spoken to, and even instituting otherwise, is about doing things together, learning together, being together, picking together, making drinks together, trading. I like the fact that you spoke about trading together, that they're all in the action that these things happen.
I mean, we try to be quite explicit that company drinks foremost is about unlocking resources around us and using them collectively. We don't use the word commons very often because it's not easily understood. Community is a word that's much better understood, and it's also more real to everyone who's coming. The commons are a relatively abstract term where we work and who we work with. So community economies, that's a practical term. Like that's a much easier term. It's like, all right, economy serves the community. That's a more practical term. But even interdependence is not exactly such a practical term all the time. But I think a tone we always had, and I mean, it might be a negative thing or positive thing, but was to be not too prescriptive around what we want people to think and do. But I can see both that this can be a shortcoming and a strength. So I'm putting it out as that.
I was actually, I still wanted to maybe like dive in a little bit, because I'm really curious about like how what you mentioned works in terms of, you said, you know, there's like a group of you who would identify as being part of company drinks, and then there are others that kind of come in and work. Maybe like just to talk about how those structures work, because I'm really,
okay.
Yeah, because, you know, is it that there are like 5 of you who would say, I'm with company drinks 100% of the time, you know, and then there are others that kind of come in and go. And because I'm really interested in the doing of many things, because it's something that I find, you know, as a part of an ethic of just working and not going around like, you know, very neoliberal capitalist ideas of like productivity and hierarchies and so on, right? But so I was just curious about like just really your own organizing, and, you know, then are there like guidelines that this is always how we maintain our relationships, and or is it just a lot more free and open? So I just wanted to like dive in a little bit.
Yeah, no, good question. And I think because it started as an arts commission, it then did this thing of growing organically, which of course then last year we were like, oh shit, this is actually not a great idea to think about yourselves like that, you know, to be transparent as an organization, to actually make it clear how you're organized, or also in terms of accessible. So, you know, not to create an exclusivity around being organic. So we've always been organized around a small team that gets paid. The team is organized in a cooperative manner. We are incorporated as a community interest company. We are incorporated as a limited, but organized as a cooperative. So there's a small team of between 5 and 6 of us. Nobody works more than 2 or 3 days. So it is small. And we, as I said, we organize ourselves cooperatively, like we earn the same. We decide things together in team meetings. And then, and now on the website, it is clearer, these 6 people are heads and hands of different activities, you know, where our personal interest and our skills sit. So Sean, for example, is leading all the growing activities and the well-being activities. So then he would look after the groups and the individuals and communities who come for this program. And then we organize it within also our financial ability, because everybody who makes sure that things can take place gets paid. There's no volunteering on the organizational level. And then, so there's like 6 heads and hands off, and we just then facilitate different groups coming, picking, growing, educational. We have more key holders now who use the building with outside of our kind of programs. So it's a constant like responding to the clearest idea of what to do next. It's a bit like that.
Yeah.
So this summer we are running a program for free school meals for primary children. We quite closely work with the council. It's quite a cool, like the council does give a lot of its contracts to local organizations. So in that sense, we deliver quite a few contracts for the council as well. But that's how it's organized. And then like I'm more looking after, let's say, the heritage side of things. So then we work with other local partners, get grants in. And then it comes, we are completely funding. We need income, you know, it's income, and then make those different programs public and available. But there's not so much volunteering, you know. I wouldn't call someone who comes for a trip and picks a volunteer, you know. It's a guest, it's a visitor, it's a user. We're trying not to use the word volunteers. We're talking about team members, then members of the different groups and users and regular visitors.
Mm.
I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it did actually, because I was very curious about like just a structure, because when we're always talking about moving away from structures, like what does it mean to call yourself a team member? Like even just the title or nomination, within these within institution making or anti-institution making or community building, right? Like it's easy to say let's just not have any structure and just be like floaty, and at the same time, that never works. And I know like there have been times where like, even to build a collective is hard. We know that. I mean, and especially when you've had like a certain foothold in, art world systems, and then you're kind of stepping out of that, you're critiquing that, you're rejecting that. There's still so much you have to keep unlearning, so much you have to keep responding to intuitively. And, sometimes, I mean, and Maddie and I have had I think Maddie's the one who said, like, how do you exist as an artist, like within compromised systems? Because we're not gonna, suddenly wake up and end capitalism tomorrow. Or like, the ideologies aren't going to change. So how do you function? Anti-capitalism might look good on paper, but not necessarily easy to do. So I'm really curious about these terms and titles and structures. And so, yeah.
I mean, I'm rejecting all those ideas of directors and stuff. It's a language we're trying not to use. But at the same time, I think we also need to recognize that the structures have to do with accessibility. So if it's, and we have a board, so if it's of use to someone to actually become a director of a company, if that's actually is of value to someone because it's then on the CV and maybe gives access to, then we would use it. But I think we are, I think we're as an organization at the moment a bit unlearning, like how structured do we need to be, and we've actually become more structured so that it becomes clearer how to access the organization. So you don't have to be afraid. And we are mainly white-led team, so like you don't have to be a white friend of the white director to get the job. Then organizing and structuring is actually super important because it describes it a bit better, and it's not reliant on your ability, it's reliant on your interest. So I think that has changed. But then it's also confusing. Then we introduced job descriptions. And because okay, now let's be clear, let's write down like all the things like the pay, the leave pay, the sick pay, the like contracts, like agreements. So it's more outspoken. And then of course people were like extremely surprised that we're suddenly so formal. And so it's of course it's a constant struggle between being clear how you operate and who is allowed in under which conditions, and not overly formalizing it. But I think that's going to be a continuous struggle. I don't think there's going to be a solution. I think that's all what organizes me in regards to like organizing public space, because it will always be the struggle between like formalized and sometimes also very useful conditions, like risk assessments or something, but and keeping it informal. So I think that tension is not going to go away. I think it will be, and there will be no right and wrong either. I think it's always adjusting one to the other, to not let one overwhelm the other. But I think it's going to be a continuous tension.
I really like that you say that being organized somehow makes you more accessible, because being more transparent about your roles means that other people know how to access you, and that when this project that we're working on or that we're looking at is about disorganizing, but actually and how that might take shape for the three organizations that are not our organizations, somebody else's organizations, is really unclear, because they still need to be able to do their job of managing their spaces and looking after their communities and things like that. So I think it's interesting Yeah.
And I think, I mean, yeah, with this kind of art world attitude of like doing 15 different jobs on like non-existing contracts and kind of overworking, self-exploiting, you know, that's just can't be a mentality that you want to maintain. You know? And I'm the only artist on the team, you know, so it's also like you also then recognize how much it's a kind of lived culture within the arts, this kind of constantly being excited over producing mode, which is actually quite dangerous, you know, to someone who can't do it, doesn't want to do it. So it's almost a toning down, and I think maybe it's also at the moment I realize when I talk about company drinks, you know, the first few years I would always do this like amazing pitch, you know, and I have no desire to do this anymore. I think we're completely toning down. You know, I'd rather risk not sounding exciting anymore, but saying something exciting we can't do. Yeah.
Oh, I relate absolutely to that feeling. It's just so strange because I've been speaking to, I mean, you know, even when we talk, like there's this idea of, you know, even to share information, like a lot of people would tell me, Meenakshi, you used to say so much more before. Why aren't you speaking out louder? And I'm like, I am speaking and it is loud. It's just that it's not in the framework of what, you know, art world expectations have typically been sometimes about how you need to be visible and project yourself in a certain way. And then there's, you know, so it's an unlearning. It's also, you're recognizing that the more you actually start to do the work, there's this weird kind of, you know, stepping back that feels completely comfortable. Like there's just no need, you know, to necessarily use the same kind of frameworks that we're so used to using. I mean, there's more comfort in actually saying, hey, you know, I've just been lying down in bed all day today and I just really couldn't get, I can't get to this to now, you know, and just to even say that and feel comfortable within your community or the people you're working with and collaborating with feels like a big deal, like, because it is recognizing well-being for what it is rather than just something that's abstract, you know.
The general exhaustion, and I think then this tiny autonomy that we have, or this tiny independence that we have, is then really of value, because we can say, okay, then let's do less, you know, let's, you know, no one is telling us what to do. We can completely do what we want, like literally, you know. There's like 2 funders who would be a little bit unhappy, but of course, I think there's within the team there's a felt responsibility that we want company drinks to continue. You know, of course, and then that comes with economics. You know, that's we always have to prepare already now the next year to make sure we are still around next year. But once we have secured this kind of quite basic economics, we can have actually a lot of decisions. No one is going to come and really count how many people came. We don't have to have 1,200 people a year. You know, and even if I would love that, but if nobody else wants that, then that's it. But yeah, thank you for sharing this. I think we have to become more comfortable in saying we are doing much less than 4 years ago. We're actually doing less. We're not doing more, huh? Yeah, but I think within the art world, that's because everybody wants to hear the next thing, the next achievement, the next goal, the next conceptual goal. But let's see. I think I also really have to be careful in company drinks. You know, I'm one of many. I can't drive the narrative. I can't introduce panic nonstop. You know, like if it goes somewhere else, then that has to be fine. In that sense, it's cooperative.
Yeah.
But it's funny because we're like, do you know Freeze Art Fair?
Yeah. Yes, we do.
So they do. You know, we do a bar there every year.
Okay.
And they're really so funny. So we are back this year. And then you think, okay, you know, you don't have to, our shelf life is quite long. Like in the beginning, people were really worried that the shelf life of company drinks is only going to be a few years, you know, and then the brand will be not of interest. But it's not true. I think we're still, and I can see it, I think we're still a very kind of solid, functioning, community-led organization. And that's of value. And I think that will survive. We don't have to say every year, oh yeah, we've done this new, we've done that new. There's great value in also just maintaining those things well. And then Freeze are like, so what are your new flavors? And I'm like, yeah, we have lots of new flavors. Who really cares? Who really cares if there's new flavors, you know? It's good we still exist. But yeah, I can feel how...
About that relationship to the art world. Like maybe it's interesting to talk, because the art world has a different economic structure, you know, it's based much more, I mean, I think they're trying at the moment to think about collectives, but you know, it's based much more on the sort of spectacle and the solo artist. And I know that you wrote about that in your Icebergian principles. But I wonder about, like, is there a desire to resist those spaces of kind of extreme extraction, or not?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think company drinks is, in that world, a good example for possible different practice. You know, I do company drinks as an artist. I don't do it as a social entrepreneur. So it is my place of practice, and therefore it's artistic practice. You know, a bit stubborn about that. And I think and then you have the iceberg again, because it's a completely possible, plausible artistic practice, but not within the market logic. But it exists, it survives. I've been doing this for a long time. And I think that's why I'm, within an art context, still quite interested in proclaiming this as a possible practice. Also for younger artists to, I mean, just, for once, get rid of this idea that if you're not part of the glossy market, you're a loser. You know, Gregory Cholette's idea around dark matter. Who's the dark matter? I don't want to be there. You know, it was a decision not to be in the art market world either. So I think within the art world, there's still a lot of kind of this emancipating to do around what's a plausible practice and what's a successful practice, and to not make it dependent on your market value, because I have no market value, like none. I know that, but it doesn't mean that I have a non-valuable practice. And people see, and because I now, at the moment, I have this quite prominent solo show at the showroom. People are a bit like, oh my God, you've done lots. You're like, yeah, and they're like, and there's an assumption that I'm upset because it never made it to the market. And I'm not. Yeah. I'm genuinely not upset about it. It really doesn't bother me. And I think just to say this out loud is important, because that market is too dominant in terms of driving the narrative, and it's boring in terms of practice. And I think a lot of artists see that. The market-driven practice is actually really quite boring, because it's only organized around spectatorship and consumership, and everything else, the other art worlds, are much more exciting.
It's only really organized around sales, and there's a very small audience of people that are actually...
I mean, even all the gallerists agree it's boring. It's that boring. Honestly, it's so boring, because you have such a conservative buyer.
Yeah,
the consumers is so conservative. What are you expecting to sell to people who want to furnish their flat, you know? But I think there's a general agreement that this market is relatively boring. And I think all of us who work not towards that market have to be clear why maintaining an art practice is of value to us. You know, I remain an artist because I can use that autonomy to try other things out, which then I don't want to be autonomous, but I use the autonomy to open up things like a company format, you know, to try formats differently. So I think it's super exciting, but yeah, that market is so boring. We all just have to keep saying this.
It is very boring. It is very boring
until it bothers them.
Reflecting on what you said, it's interesting that we talk about, like, when you say this is an artistic practice, this is, you know, a value as an artistic practice. It's not about being a social entrepreneur, because I know that even in the context of India, where the market is still very, very dominant, like my practice is like people don't understand what I'm necessarily doing, and, you know, how you even like sustaining yourself. I mean, not that artistic practice is necessarily about sustaining yourself financially ever, but there's a resentment that we can call this practice. Like, I've had friends who have very much, you know, a practice that's very centered on the market, meaning they're artists that didn't make it. They make sculpture, they make paintings, so they're conceptual artists, right? And then they look at me and they're like, well, you just moved on. Like, you're able to get opportunities because your practice is, the thing now. And so there's a resentment of also reorganizing the industry, or to say, I actually don't care, this is so boring, I don't care for the dominant narrative. But even your own peers actually can be resentful of it, because it means, because they still want that, but they also don't want it, because you know what I mean? And it's a crazy space, to be honest.
The
thing that Company Drinks has become part of, called the Interdependence. Did you set that up, and is that partly a kind of way of shifting? Because part of the reason we wanted to set up the Food Art Research Network was to connect researchers who were sort of doing similar work in different parts of the world, and also a lot of the researchers are kind of working in long-term kind of community projects that do interesting work around environmental restoration or community economies. And often that can be, you're the only artist in a context, and you want to speak to other artists who are doing similar things in different places to learn from each other. And I wondered if the Interdependence was partly like that, or what was the impetus behind it? Sorry to really shift away from that world.
Okay. It came out of this initial CERN network, the Community Economy Research Network. And I think it was a workshop in Italy 2 years ago, yeah. And we were trying to think how to make the scale of the practice within the network more visible. Because of course the killer argument for each of us, it's like, oh, it's nice, but what, what are you achieving? You're working with like 3 people. This like argument of scale and not being able to scale up. And I think it was a frustration for a long time for many, both for the researchers, also for the practitioners, that it's always regarded as a kind of mini intervention somewhere, temporary. But we all know the lived experience is that it's much bigger, and we all do this, and we do it over many years. So it was just an attempt to find something that can identify that scale of us not being together in an organized way, but being together through practice and ethics and discussion. So the IDT became this like identifier, just to say there's different practices. When we started it, and that's again why I'm like a bit hesitant, we thought, this is going to be like super big, it's going to replace the limited within 2 years. When you're really excited by an idea, like this is going to be so successful, like everybody's going to put IDT behind. And IDT was not meant to be a membership scheme. It was just to be meant an affiliation with the Community Economies principles. So we've started it, and then just just to do with resources, it's still relatively small, but we kind of the aim is to open it up. But it is, even for those who are part of it now, it's a useful tool to say, look, those practices are connected and interconnected, and we are interconnected both on a peer-to-peer level, that we actually, that's our network. That's like there's like 3 drinks companies in the IDT. That's also the colleagues we talk to when we're about like, are bottles more sustainable than cans? Also very practical questions, but also to not feel small, and to use it and say, no, this is a multinational. I mean, we don't use the word multinational. We use multi-local or translocal, but to be able to refer to that bigger scale whenever someone says, oh, it's nice, but what are you actually achieving? So there's a bit of like sadness, because the IDT, I think I didn't have the personal resources to grow it more and push it more and support it more. But I think it's a very clear concept. I think as soon as we have a bit more resources, it probably needs 2 people to work on it for a year part-time. It needs marketing and community. It does need those things. Otherwise, people don't hear about it. I think it could work really, really well. And it works for those who are part of it. It already works quite well. Because you can go like, oh yeah, but we have a sister company in Italy. You know, you sometimes can also do this like stupid business speak to just kill an argument, you know. So yeah. So the IDT is by affiliation, and it's open to groups, companies, social enterprise, individuals, researchers. And the idea is that you put the IDT behind your name.
Yeah, I know a lot of artists and curators who were starting to call themselves interdependent curators instead of independent curators. And this started in a conversation that was happening between a bunch of international curators at the beginning of the pandemic, and everyone started to say this is not. So interdependence became such a sort of crazy word at the beginning of last year. You know, it was used a lot, and it was really nice to see you taking it a step further.
I mean, I think it's also going to be used more in order to tackle this very unpleasant relationship we have with capitalist economies, and we have to tackle it. You know, there's no purist solution to anything, and I think especially in the art world, it's still not done very much. Of course, you don't want BP as your sponsor, but the money is constantly coming from areas that you wouldn't fully support. And I think to acknowledge this and say, okay, if we don't want it, what are we going to do? I think that's for me a kind of next step in the discussion within art economies. And we just had an example because I'm part of this British art show in Aberdeen. Aberdeen is the oil capital of Europe. You know, there's nothing that's not sponsored by BP in Aberdeen. It's like everything. So you can't come with an approach like, yeah, no, I'm anti-BP, because it's all BP, you know, and it's completely ingrained in the culture and has been for 100 years. So I think those situations that need a slightly different approach, like how can you be against fossil fuel usage, but still acknowledge the situation you are in and think about steps to move out. And I think those discussions will be more fruitful if they're actually quite broad, you know, if they step away from the kind of you're the enemy, we know how to do it model, which the art world doesn't do either. The art world does it often well rhetorically. You know, they build a position for themselves of like the kind of ethical position, but I think in practice there's a massive, massive gap still. I think in actually reorganizing economies. But that's something we're gonna address through the Rural School of Economics with partners in Aberdeen who know also the regional economy much better. You know, I'm not a specialist in Scottish oil industry, like definitely not. But I think that's a slightly different angle on the topic to also acknowledge an unpleasant interdependence in the arts.
I feel like that might be a really good place to stop. It's an uneasy place to stop, but it's a good place. And we are at an hour.
Yeah.
So nice meeting you. Sorry.
Yeah.